Yes, that is the Grabber, and he is back. Honestly, wasn't sure whether we'd see him again, and I was probably 50-50 about whether I wanted to see him again. Uh, but he is back, and let's see what he does this time, starting with the IMDb plot. As Fenn, now 17, struggles with the life after his captivity, his sister begins receiving calls in her dreams from the black phone and seeing disturbing visions of three boys being stalked at a winter camp known as Alpine Lake. All right, so yeah, he's back, and I guess, you could say they made some interesting choices with how they decided to do this film, and we'll get into that momentarily, and some thoughts on some things that have been said about the movie, and obviously what I think of the movie. And obviously, with this being a new film just released, we'll try to keep this spoiler free for you guys as much as possible. I should have mentioned this shirt was courtesy of Universal Pictures for a promotion that we did at Promote Horror. Right, get all that out of the way. And all right, so yeah, I think the summary there kind of covers it. This is a movie kind of mixed in a dream world and the real world, and obviously, the two siblings are a little bit older now, which admittedly was a little weird. I kind of had them pictured much younger in the first film, and to me that kind of made it work for me a little bit better, being them a little bit younger of age. It was a little bit weird, especially Fenn being a little bit older. I don't know why. It just was a tad weird for watching, but they're older. It's a couple of years after the events and so forth, and obviously both of them, obviously more Fenn than anything, went through quite the ordeal there with the Grabber, and you would have thought maybe the film would have carried a lot of weight on him. But the real focus is more on the sister. And, we kind of find out a little later on why that is, why she's a little bit more of the focus in this film. So I would say, they kind of, maybe they definitely lean more towards her. They don't forget him, but, in a way they do. And, I'll comment on that shortly. But... So, in a weird way, this is, they, I don't want to say a prequel, but they definitely, give you some backstory here. You're going to learn some backstory about the Grabber and even, his relationship to these siblings and why he's torturing them. Which, now thinking about it, you almost see part one and kind of thought, that was... how random was him selecting Fenn and capturing him and some of the other boys. And, it seemed kind of random. Obviously the Grabber was looking for something specific, but, overall it seemed kind of random. And then obviously you find out he's, kind of the origins of the Grabber and some of the boys that he originally captured and so forth. So, you're kind of figuring, where, why does Fenn and his sister, a target for the Grabber and so forth. So we kind of get that filled in. And I guess, after, this setup, we get a little bit of a dream sequence and reintroduction to the brother and sister. We end up in Alpine Lake, and that's where the main setting of the film is. And obviously it's a very, very cold, wintry place. And, that is where, the two siblings are going to really try to take on the Grabber here. And, they're going to have a little bit of help from some people around them and so forth. But, that's where we're going to end up with a showdown here. And so, so the film is basically, consisting of, some nightmare sequences, some dream sequences, and so forth, haunting mostly the girl. Fenn has a little bit, but not as much. It is mostly his sister. And again, as it goes on, we fill in a little bit of the history there and where the grabber came from, and then, what the relationship is with him and the brother and the sister. And, then obviously we have the big showdown the grabber versus basically the siblings and a few other people there. So that's the basics of it. So yeah, like I said, they made some interesting choices here. I guess with the sequel, you kind of want to maybe build on some of the things you made in the first film, and I think they accomplished that. They gave you a little bit of detail where the grabber is. Maybe does that eliminate, I don't know if they're going to do a third part or whatever they're going to do. Maybe that kind of eliminates a prequel. I guess you could stick it in between somewhere, if you really wanted to. But you fill in the backstory of the grabber. You kind of find out where, he comes from and so forth. And I'd like to maybe know a few more things, but, I guess it's a starting place. I guess, with a bad guy, you can't know everything. And then obviously his relationship with the brother and the sister. And again, I really wanted to watch the first one over again before I watched this one, but that never happened. So, I don't remember, all the specifics of how he was choosing the boys. And so forth. I obviously remember him in the car with the balloons and so forth, and grabbing the kids. But I don't remember if he overall, what the overall reasoning was, why he picked individual ones. Obviously, when you see this, you see, why, at least, given the why, a possibility of why he chose Finn back, in the first movie. Obviously, in this one, he's kind of going after them a little bit more for revenge. I mean, why not? Finn, basically killed him. I don't know that they necessarily covered, how the grabber kind of went from, basically dying there to coming back now. I'm not really sure if they covered that or not, or how that came to be. But it is, I guess you're just supposed to go along with the whole kind of supernatural vibe that this movie has, especially, with these boys, these spirits, calling back on a phone and cluing in, the siblings on what is going on, and, that they need help as well, and so forth. I think, much of the horror, obviously the grabber is the central character. He's horror all, every time you see him. And, but besides, I'll touch on him in a second, but besides that, a lot of the horror in this movie is in these dream sequences. And, I think, to me, probably the best one was and I won't get into too much detail. I don't want to ruin it for those who have not seen it. But there's a scene where I guess, when they kind of first get to this cabin in this wintry place, where she's having a dream, and I guess I'll just say it's kind of a window sequence and leave it at that. And I thought that was one of the better ones and my favorite one. Also, maybe because it kind of had some blood in it and so forth. Not, this movie's not tremendously heavy on the blood, but that was one scene, and it is rated R. Just double checking. I was pretty sure I saw it before, and probably rated R a lot because of that particular dream sequence over many of the other ones. But yeah, a lot of the horror is definitely in these dream sequences. They may try to jump scare you a little bit, but I think it's just more of trying to get you with these boys and trying to make them, seem scary, seem spooky a little bit, and maybe pop up a little bit here and there. But, not, anything overwhelmingly more than what we saw in the first movie. I think, in the first movie, it just seemed like, a lot of phone calls and so forth. So maybe it did go into a little bit more detail. And then the grabber, I think, obviously him now kind of being more of a definite supernatural being and being in a dream world, he could do different things. And I thought they did some good stuff. He has very, obviously in the first one, his mask was a big thing, and then, some of the movements he made. Um, his dialogue's all right, but I think, the mask and some of the moments he made is kind of what made him really in the first one. And I think this one, they were, because, got a little bit more flexibility, they did some interesting things as far as his mask and kind of, I don't know if you want to say taking it off, but I guess removing it in certain ways and so forth. So they used some liberties there, and I thought that worked. That was pretty cool stuff there as well. So if you're kind of really freaked out by his mask, that they may have added a little bit to that this time around. So maybe it got you even a little bit more this time. Um, and then an interesting point, made I saw on Twitter. I don't remember who mentioned it. I think someone mentioned it, or maybe more than one person mentioned it. Um, was the comparison to the Grabber and Freddy, and obviously as for an old school horror fan like myself, or I guess old school '80s horror fan, like myself, Freddy is very important to me and so forth. So I would imagine that I watched this movie, and if I hadn't read that first, I would imagine that I would have caught that and seen some comparisons there. Um, but it definitely, I think, had, whether they did it on purpose or not, definitely had some influence in this movie. You definitely see it. Um, Obviously, very obviously with the dream sequences. And, I think, they make it very clear they do this, thing where other people really can't see the grabber, but things are happening in real life because the person may be fighting the grabber. So it may look like the person is doing some really weird stuff or just is nuts. But in the dream world, they're really fighting him or doing something, other, related in a different world. And you can see them. And, that's a big thing that we see in Freddy, obviously. Um, and then, obviously, you can make your comparisons with Freddy and the Grabber, to, big characters out to, kill young teens, I guess, or children, whatever. The backstory of where Freddy began, and then so forth, and then, much of his adventure was killing, young, either teens or college kids and so forth. So, you get a little bit of that as well. So there's the comparisons. You can see that. I don't know, um, again, specifically if the filmmakers were just using that as a reference or they were just doing their thing or whatever. Um, Interestingly enough, I always debate, original horror versus not. And, obviously this is another character who, they can try to build on, try to make him, like the next, as I try to always think of as this new generation or this next generation of horror icons, kind of similar to, for me, a Freddy, a Jason, a Michael, and so forth. I think, obviously Art the Clown is kind of cementing himself as one of those as we move forward in this new universe of him. Um, and you could see the Grabber, depending where they go with this, as maybe tried to knock on that door. I don't know he's there or not. The movie did okay and so forth. I don't know what they have other plans, but obviously when you kind of, make a reflection of him as Freddy, that's a big step and a big, thing. And whether he becomes a horror icon or not, maybe is not the point. Um, but definitely, kind of, using, I guess if you're this generation or new generation of horror fan, you're watching this, maybe, the Grabber can have that same effect on you as, Freddy had on me and many others, back then. And if you've never seen Freddy, then, you might come into this movie and be like, oh, wow, that's pretty cool or whatever, this and that. And you may have different feelings and views about how you see this movie if you're not familiar with Freddy, or maybe you've seen Freddy, but you don't, maybe not seen all the movies or whatever. You're just not of that generation, if not in that depth of a horror fan. You're probably going to see this movie in a very different way. So, it may be a thing for you guys, the newer horror fans. So, definitely different perspectives of how you can come about this and think about this movie. Um, Again, overall, I wasn't sure that they would do a part two. Obviously thought the door was open. Obviously, the door's open all the time, especially with this production house, good or bad. But you know, it at the end of the day, I don't think they did any damage. If they would have left it at part one, I think I would have been okay. Um, Again, there were things I liked, things that were okay. I thought some of the things I saw on Twitter were probably a little more positive than maybe I thought the movie was. Again, all matter of opinion. That's fine. Um, but again, it's not a bad movie. I definitely thought, they did some interesting things. Taking it to a winter place and whatever is not something we see a lot. And definitely was a change of scenery and was a big step, to kind of take them out of the house and out of the neighborhood and so forth and go completely somewhere else was a big step. Interesting choice, and I think it worked. Again, it was a little weird and so forth, and maybe a little quick. Maybe if they would have done a second part and kind of kept it in the same neighborhood, and then maybe for a part three. But whatever. I guess that's the way they wanted to kind of explain his story. So, it is 50-50 there. Like I said, I liked that one scene. Some of the scenes with the boys, but I didn't think it's overall too scary. I think maybe the first one was a little scarier in a different way, because you have someone who's kind of taking children and so forth, and then you have the boy. He's locked up in the room and getting these weird phone calls. It was just that seemed to be a different level of scary than maybe the scary here. I guess they showed the boys more, and they showed them in obviously the cabin area, and one time kind of underwater, and then like I said, the window scene. So it just seemed a little different scary wise, and I don't know. And then I guess once you've seen the grabber now, I guess seeing him a second time around, it just, even though like I said they did do some good stuff with the mask, and I'm glad they kind of expanded a little bit. Once you've kind of seen him again, he's just not, I don't know, as scary. I don't know. I guess it's just something more scary about a guy in a mask showing up in a van and grabbing somebody than in a dream sequence or whatever. But again, that's what scares you and what frightens you and what doesn't frighten me or whatever. So yeah, I think while it seems, let's see what it says here. Okay, 6.7 here on IMDb out of 10, and a good 8,000 plus ratings here. So that's not bad for IMDb. So I think people are at least that have watched this, or at least probably seem to be more on the positive side than the negative side. I think I'm going to shoot down the middle on this one. I think it's definitely a solid movie. I think the kids did a good job of acting. The new people they introduced into the story were fine. Like I said, they did some interesting things and some good things. Did it blow me away? No. Did I want probably a little bit more information than they may have given me? Yeah. Am I left with still a question or two? Probably. So yeah, I think I'm giving this one 2.5 pools of blood. I kind of want to go down the middle with it. I absolutely do not remember how many pools of blood I gave the first one. I would imagine I lean towards at least liking the movie, and at least probably 3. But I'm not for certain. I did not go back and look. But yeah, I think I'm going to go down the middle on this one. Definitely, I think if you did enjoy the first one, I definitely do not see a reason why you wouldn't watch this one. A good movie, and I think at least is going to, if you're curious about the grabber and you're curious about the brother and sister here, and you wanted, you kind of left that first movie and you wanted a little bit more information, I think maybe you watch this one to at least get that, and then see where it goes as far as what you like about the rest of the story, and whether it scares you or not and so forth. So that's going to be 2.5 pools of blood out of 5 for this one. So with that, horrorsgoryreviews.blogspot.com is where you can find all my reviews, written in video. Certainly mostly video reviews for a long time now, so you can like and subscribe like everybody else wants you to do here on YouTube. If not, no worries, it is okay. I thank you for your time regardless. Twitter, Facebook information down below as well. Reach out. You want to talk about this movie, other movies, or something you want me to review, please feel free. And in the comment section, once you guys see the movie, your thoughts are always welcome in the comment section. Whether you agree or not, it is all good. And with that, do not answer any weird phone calls, and I will catch you on the next review, horror fans.